Hello everybody and welcome to the third video in a row on Wuthering Heights. Apparently I seem to be in a Wuthering Heights rabbit hole. I cannot stop thinking about this novel, and 2 days ago I went to the cinema to see the new adaptation and I have some thoughts. While I'm not one to jump onto a trend or be up to date with everything that's hyped at the moment, I'm definitely participating into the Wuthering Heights hype, and I feel like I need to be thankful to it because it gave me a reason to revisit the novel, rethink about it, and appreciate it more. And you can check my last video if you want to see more about that whole journey, what my first impression of Wuthering Heights was and what I think about it now. But given that the hype around this movie was the main reason for me reading this book a second time and discovering and rediscovering this piece of literature, I thought I kind of owed it to this film to go and see it. Now, I have to preface everything by saying that I'm not a person who is particularly interested in book to movie adaptations. Books and films are two very different mediums. Obviously, no news there. But the thing is, you get different things from interacting with each medium. And if there is a book I love it for being a book. I love what I get out of interacting with that particular way of telling a story. So I don't feel the desire to see the same story told in a different way, if that makes sense. And it goes the other way around too. So if I love a film, for example, I don't feel a desire to go and read the book because I appreciate that story for the way it was told the first time. And an example here would be Dead Poets Society, which is one of my favorite films, and I know there's a book that was written after this story. I heard it wasn't really good, so that was another reason why I didn't want to read it. But ultimately, I love the film for being what it is, and I think it's very effective at telling the story. So I don't have a desire to see the story in a different medium. Of course, that is not to say that all book adaptations are bad or that books should never be adapted into movies. Far from it, and I've watched my fair share of book to movie adaptations. It's just to say that I'm personally not the person who gets really excited by them, if that makes sense. More than that, there are definitely books that have a narrative that's more flexible and that's easier to adapt into a movie, and Jane Austen's novels come to mind. They have some amazing adaptations. Some of my favorites are Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, which I think were both made in 1995, if I'm not wrong. I'll correct myself if I am. But if so, 1995 was a great year for Jane Austen adaptations. I've loved the books, I've loved the films, nothing against book to movie adaptations. But what I think maybe my biggest problem with it is, I feel stupid saying this, but bear with me. So a movie adaptation will never be like the book, because ultimately when you take a piece of work and you transform it and adapt it for a different medium, it becomes the screenwriter's or the director's interpretation of that work. Now, this can definitely be interesting, don't get me wrong. I think the discussions around book to movie adaptations are very interesting, and obviously I'm making a video about that. The main point of what I'm trying to say is that I don't have any kind of expectations. I'm not the kind of person that's like, the movie has to be exactly like the book and it has to follow it perfectly because that's how it has to be. Because again, it can never do that. There are two different ways of telling stories, and obviously you need to make some changes if you want to adapt. It's an adaptation. Some changes need to be involved, and those changes basically mean that the story is interpreted in a certain way to fit the screen. With this particular adaptation of Wuthering Heights, given how it was marketed and all the discourse around it, my expectations were even lower. As opposed to Jane Austen, I think Wuthering Heights is a very difficult novel to adapt into a commercial story. Not necessarily adapt into a movie. Maybe it could be done, but into a commercial movie, not so much. I don't think the story lends itself to a Hollywood adaptation without making some changes that end up completely modifying the original story. So basically, I went into the theater having the lowest of low expectations, and I think that was a good thing because I have to say I quite enjoyed the movie. It was quite entertaining. If you are to divorce it from this idea of being an adaptation and just look at it as a standalone story, I don't think it was bad. It wasn't a masterpiece by any means, but it wasn't a bad movie. It kept you engaged. It made you care about what happened. So I was pleasantly surprised as far as that's concerned. But in this video, I'm not going to look at it as a separate story. I'm going to look and to review this film from the lens of it being an adaptation of Wuthering Heights and seeing how faithful of an adaptation it is. And when I'm talking about faithfulness, don't get me wrong, again, like I've said, I'm not the person who says, well, in the book this scene happens after this scene and these very important things should happen. By no means. Of course, there are some things you have to change, but when I'm looking for faithfulness, I'm looking to see if the essence of the story is being kept in the adaptation. So that's kind of how I looked at this film. Like I've said before, I personally don't think Wuthering Heights is a novel that's easy to adapt into a commercial Hollywood story, which this film definitely was, because it was a huge budget and it aimed to appeal to as big of an audience as possible. And there is one main reason for that, and that is that the protagonists in Wuthering Heights are just unlikable. There's no way of getting around it. And I'll bring back Jane Austen. So in Jane Austen's novels, everything is very clear-cut. I mean, you have your main characters who are flawed. They're not perfect by any means, but you root for them, you care for them, you see them grow, you see them learn from their mistakes. And then you have your mean and rude characters who are just mean and rude, and we just don't like them. So you have this very clear distinction between characters, which makes it then easy to understand, comprehend. It's very easy to decide who you want to side with. Wuthering Heights, not so much. Catherine and Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights, as much as you're trying to understand them, as much as you're trying to see where they're coming from, there are some points where they are just obnoxious and you just want to, I personally felt that way, I wanted to shake them and tell them to get it together and to stop acting so dramatically. But of course there is a whole point to them being this way, and again, if you want a more in-depth analysis of that, I have the whole book review. What I'm trying to get at is that the clear distinction you have in Jane Austen's novels between these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, is completely impossible to apply to Wuthering Heights, which becomes problematic when you want to create a very popular story or a very commercial story, because in Hollywood stories you generally want to relate to the protagonist, you want to like him, you want to root for him, but that is impossible for Wuthering Heights. In Wuthering Heights, Catherine and Heathcliff especially are basically like natural forces. So we can compare Heathcliff to something like a volcano. If you see a video of a volcano on YouTube and you have this distance which in the novel is given by the narrative frameworks of Nellie telling the story to Lockwood, telling the story to us. So if you have this distance, you can be mesmerized by how the lava falls down and all that. But if you live near a volcano and its eruption, as beautiful as it might be, destroys your house and turns your life upside down, you're no longer able to appreciate that beauty. But more than that, a volcano is not good or bad. You won't say the volcano is immoral for erupting and destroying people's houses, because it's a natural element. That's what it does. It lives outside of our human understanding of good and bad. And that's kind of how Heathcliff is as well. So he is this natural force. He does create a lot of destruction. So like a volcano, it can create a lot of destruction around it. But ultimately, he lives outside of what our understanding of morality, of good and bad is. So we cannot really judge it through those filters. So because of this, any adaptation that aims to reach a large audience needs to make some essential changes to the characters in order to make them more palatable. And this was definitely true of Emerald Fennel's adaptation. There were a lot of changes made to the story that at the end I think the only common thing that this adaptation and the book have is the names of the places and the characters. But other than that, if you are to pick it apart and look at how it's constructed and compare the construction of the novel to the construction of the film, in my opinion, they become two completely different stories. But before we get into that, because I feel like I might be a bit too negative, I'll start with what I liked about the film. So like I've said, it was quite entertaining. I wouldn't say it was a waste of time watching it. I had fun going and see it, and I'm happy I watched it. Not just because I can talk about it, but genuinely it was entertaining. I also thought aesthetically it was really beautiful. There's a lot of shots that look really nice, and I liked how you have this contrast between with the Wuthering Heights being kind of messy and in disorder, and then the Linton's house at Thrushcross Grange is very stylized. It feels almost like a dollhouse. I would say some of the sets were a bit too stylized for me. There was at some point, if you were to just show me that shot and without any context, I would have believed that it was a Tim Burton movie. So there were points where it kind of took me out of the story, but overall I liked it. I think it added something interesting to the film, so that was a big plus. I also liked the young versions of Catherine and Heathcliff, and I personally thought they had more chemistry than the grown-up versions. I especially loved the scene where they seek shelter from the rain, and young Catherine tells Heathcliff something along the lines of, if you can see a little bit of blue between the clouds, and that means you can hope that the rain will stop, or something like that. Either way, it was really sweet, and I liked that scene. And that's pretty much it with the positives. So let's lean into the negativity and get into Emerald Fennel's adaptation of Emily Bronte's novel. First and foremost, it has to be said, and I know every reviewer says this adaptation ignores about half or even more than half of the novel. But okay, that's not the worst thing. I can understand that the director didn't want a 5-hour-long story about families who basically continue to get married to each other. Now, the question remains, is it a good adaptation of that first part of the story? Short answer is no. Long answer, the first big change that you notice in the film is that they got rid of Hindley's character completely. Now, in the book, Hindley is Catherine's brother. Mr. Earnshaw, who is their father, one day brings Heathcliff to Wuthering Heights, and he starts raising him as his own child. Sometimes you even get the impression that he might like Heathcliff more than Hindley, but that's neither here nor there. The idea is that as children, they are all on equal footing, and Mr. Earnshaw, as a father, I think I quite liked him because he's quite lenient in his parenting style. Keep in mind, he's a wealthy man in the Victorian period, so you would expect for him to have these high standards of education and politeness from his kids, but he basically lets Heathcliff and Catherine do whatever they want. He doesn't impose anything on them, so while he is overseeing Wuthering Heights, Catherine and Heathcliff are free to roam the wilderness, to go and run in the fields and do as they please. The problem arises when Book Mr. Earnshaw dies, which he does fairly quickly, and Hindley takes over because Hindley becomes jealous of Heathcliff when they grow up. So because of his jealousy, he degrades Heathcliff to being a servant, and it is basically Hindley's fault for Catherine saying that it would degrade herself to marry Heathcliff, which of course determines Heathcliff to leave and come back to get revenge on all the people who stood in between him and Catherine, starting with Hindley. So Hindley is the first one that he targets with his revenge once he come back. So as you can see, Hindley, Catherine's brother, pretty important character for the book. Now, if you get rid of him in a movie adaptation, obviously you cannot completely get rid of him because he does some things that move the story forward. So the solution was to combine the father character with Hindley and make him into this ruthless, cruel, alcoholic, gambling addicted and abusive, horrible man. The change in the father's character also changes the dynamic between Heathcliff and Cathy, because if in the book the bond between Heathcliff and Cathy is based on the fact that they both share this innate wild nature that is, I don't know, free and uninhibited and has this desire of being outside, of connecting to the wilderness. In the film, giving the change in the father's character and the abuse he inflicts on the kids, their bond is quickly created by the fact that they are both traumatized. And Heathcliff also becomes a protector for Kathy, saying that I will do everything in my power to protect you from his abuse, which we can see is the first instance of something essential in the story straying away from the source material. This change in the father character snowballs, and I think it ultimately changes everything about the story, because in the novel the contrast between Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange comes from this contrast between the wild and free world of nature and the contained and measured world of civilization. For Catherine, Wuthering Heights is a place where she could roam free, where she could express herself fully, whereas Thrushcross Grange, as I said, is the pinnacle of civilization, with the siblings there being dressed nicely, sitting at around tea tables, reading, and so on. So there is this contrast in the book, but there is no indication that one is better than the other. There is no moral superiority that Thrushcross Grange has over Wuthering Heights, because it's like we would say that humans are morally superior to a volcano. They are two completely different things, and this contrast between the two estates obviously reflects Catherine's nature and the conflict between these two sides that are pulling her, and that she has to choose between. Now, in the movie, this contrast it's kept, but it is quite changed, because given that you change the father's character, so all of a sudden, instead of having this lenient father who just lets his kids roam free, we have this depraved man who drinks and gambles his fortune and brings upon ruin onto his daughter and everybody around him. The contrast is no longer between the natural world and the civilized one, but it becomes between this disgusting world of sin and depravity and the civilized world of decency. And when you introduce the idea of sin, which this movie does, you do create a hierarchy, because you can say, and it's implied, given that Catherine wants to escape from that, it's implied that the civilized world of the Lintons is better than the sinful world that the Earnshaw live in. So there is this moral superiority that the Lintons have over the Earnshaws, which completely undermines the core message of the novel, I think, because instead of it being about Catherine's desire to live outside of culture, outside of civilization, and being boxed in, it becomes the story about the conflict between one's sinful and virtuous nature. And you might say I'm reading too much into it, but again, the idea of deprivation is clearly illustrated in the novel, and you have it mentioned a few times about how this is a disgusting world. And the problem becomes when it isn't reflected in Catherine's character, because Catherine doesn't really care about being a virtuous lady, which she kind of does in the book. She cares about being seen as a civilized and as a proper lady at times, not always, but at times she does care about that. But in the film, Catherine has no desire in being virtuous. We see her having no problem having an affair as a married woman, and the only reason she wants to marry Linton is because she wants to get out of poverty. But this contrast between the two estates isn't relevant for her own conflict as a character in the film, which again, it just shows how the change in the father character propagate into changing all the other characters around him. Another character that is completely changed is Isabella. In the novel, Isabella is a sheltered young lady who is obviously charmed by the mysterious Heathcliff. Like in the film, Heathcliff has absolutely no romantic interest in Isabella. But in the book, for me personally, this moment is when I just couldn't possibly side with Heathcliff, and I became so uncomfortable with his character, because in the book Heathcliff takes complete advantage of Isabella's feelings for him in order to get his fortune. He gets married to her, abuses her. Isabella leaves him because she cannot stand the abuse. She leaves him while pregnant. She gives birth. Heathcliff doesn't really care about that. The point is that Isabella is a direct victim of this natural element that Heathcliff is. It's just so unsettling to see how he takes advantage of her innocence and of her naivety. In the movie, they kind of keep this idea of her being sheltered, but they introduce the idea of her being really repressed, and they make Heathcliff very upfront with her. He tells her directly that I will never love you, I will treat you poorly, I'm only marrying you for my own interest. Do you consent to this? And she is perfectly fine with it. She goes along with it. It's suggested that she actually likes and enjoys his brutish nature because she's kinky like that. And the dog scene. Oh my god, the dog scene. I'd prefer if it deleted itself from my brain, but unfortunately it's not possible. Again, the story with Isabella, it reinforces this dichotomy between depravity and decency, which I'll say again isn't reflected in any other character. And here is the thing. When you build a story, usually the setting, the places, they have meaning for the characters themselves, and you can look at the places and how they're described and how they changed and mirror that to how the characters change. But in this film, that isn't the case, because like I've said, this contrast between sin and virtue, decency and depravity doesn't really make sense for any of the characters. Therefore, I think it leaves some loose threads, and ultimately I think the decision of getting rid of Hindley and making the father the way he is in the film wasn't fully thought out, because it seems like the writer, the director, didn't think about how that would impact the whole story, if that makes sense. Another character change I didn't like is Nellie. For me, Nellie was my favorite in Wuthering Heights. I liked the fact that she was educated and she educated herself. I liked the fact that she was a great storyteller. I liked how she managed to navigate with such ability the chaos of Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. Of course, she's an unreliable narrator. We cannot know exactly how much she changed the story she tells, but nevertheless, I like her as a character. She's also empathetic. There is a scene in the book where Heathcliff struggles a lot because he sees Isabella starting to like Edgar and starting to being attracted to the Lintons and to their world. And Heathcliff obviously feels bad about that because he'll never be like Edgar. We'll get into that. And Nellie is there to comfort him, and he tells him, well, your origins are unknown. So for all you know, you might be a prince in disguise. Your parents might be king and queen who can just buy Wuthering Heights with the money they make in a week. Nellie is not the perfect character, don't get me wrong. She does things in the book that make you be like, I don't think that was the best way to go around that situation. But you have to keep in mind the people she's dealing with. And in the film, they painted her as the villain. They make it so that it's Nellie's fault for Heathcliff leaving and for the miscommunication between Heathcliff and Catherine. And it's ultimately her fault for Catherine dying because she is jealous. She's jealous of Catherine. She's jealous of Heathcliff for taking Catherine away from her. So she acts out of jealousy. And it just doesn't sit right with me. But again, I go back to this idea of the characters in Wuthering Heights not being straightforward. You cannot put them into these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. These are the guys we root for, these are the guys we want to see suffer. Because it's complex and it transcends this dichotomy. So seeing her be the villain in the movie just didn't sit right with me, and for me it was personally disappointing. We also have the narrative frame is completely removed. So Nellie becomes less powerful because it's not her story, it's just the story and she's part of it, but it's not the story told through her eyes. So yes, I didn't like the direction they went in with Nellie's character. I found that pretty disappointing because she was one of my favorites. Felt like I was personally attacked by this change. Now, the last thing I want to say about the characters, Catherine and Heathcliff are just way too nice. So like I've said in the book, and I encourage you, if you haven't read it, I encourage you to read it and try your best to side with Catherine and Heathcliff. I'm curious to see what your conclusion will be at the end. So they are just too obnoxious. Catherine less so because she also dies in the middle of the novel. But Heathcliff, he is so cruel to Isabella, to his and Isabella's kids afterwards, and everything he does is just driven by his desire to get revenge, no matter what. He completely disregards the suffering he inflicts on the people around him, and you just cannot side with that. I mean, maybe if you're a person that wants people to suffer, yes, but if you're a normal human being, at some point you say no, this is no longer okay. In the film, however, they couldn't take the risk of making them unlikable, so we just get these two misunderstood characters. They might be a bit moody and a bit rude, but ultimately you see where they're coming from. They've been through a lot of trauma, and everybody just is getting in between their love story. Even with marrying Isabella, Heathcliff is very proper about it. You cannot really fault him because he puts everything on the table for Isabella and she accepts. So now, in the end, I'd say my advice, if you've seen this movie without reading the book and you're thinking, I liked this, I'd like to live more in this universe, let me read the book. Don't, because you'll be very, very disappointed. Don't get me wrong. Wuthering Heights is an amazing novel, and I think people should read it. My problem is that all these adaptations just create the wrong expectations of what Wuthering Heights is. It is definitely an interpretation of Wuthering Heights, and I've read somewhere where it said that this is basically how the director imagined Wuthering Heights at 14, which makes a lot of sense. It has basically nothing to do with the story other than names and the places. So you have to keep in mind, if this film made you consider reading Wuthering Heights, keep that in mind going into it. So that was my main problem with the movie, and how, in my opinion, it completely changed the essence of what the book is. But I have some extra complaints to make. I will say something that didn't bother me is the heightened sexuality. I think that's a fair way to interpret the story and to look at Catherine's and Heathcliff's relationship, because in the novel we get Nelly's perspective, and Nelly is present in a lot of situations, but she's not present everywhere. She's not glued at the hip with Catherine or with Heathcliff. So we can definitely imagine that something like that would have happened between them, given the fact that they were so unrestricted. And of course, we're not in the Victorian period anymore, so we no longer look at sex as this sinful thing to do, and it can definitely fall into the whole idea of attraction towards nature and how it is restricted and repressed by civilization. So I didn't mind it. Again, I thought it was a fair direction to go into, but what I did hate is the beginning and how it combines sexuality with executions. It was the least favorite part of the film. If I said that I would like the dog scene with Isabella to delete itself from my brain, the beginning scene, I just hope I entered 5 minutes later in the theater, because what was that? What was the point of that? There was no reason to show it, because at no point in the book are executions mentioned, are relevant. And, Chekhov's gun, if you show a gun in the first act, you have to fire it by the third act. If you begin with an execution in such a graphic way, and I expected, I was thinking, are Catherine and Heathcliff going to get executed because they do something so outrageous for the Victorian society? Because that's the expectation it builds. That's how stories work. Completely pointless. The fact that the film begins with black screen and moaning, and the first thought is, and I'm sure I'm not the only one in this, but the first thought was, it's a sex scene, which makes sense. Again, no problem with the sexuality of the story, that makes sense. But then subverting it into this whole scene of people laughing at the man dying and getting an erection while being executed, it just felt disgusting to me. There is different kinds of disgust and unpleasantness. And referring back to the book, what Heathcliff does, as long as you see him as this force of nature that lives outside of morality, yes, he is destructive, but it's a destruction that transcends morality. Like a volcano is destructive. You're not going to say that the volcano was immoral for destroying houses and villages and killing people. But with execution is something very human. It's something very tied to what humans perceive as being right and being wrong. It introduces a whole new dimension to the story that wasn't explored, that wasn't needed, and it felt like pure shock value, and I hated it. And the thing is, you can just cut it out and the story isn't changed in any way because it's completely irrelevant. It is kind of relevant to that what I've said, that contrast between depravity and sinfulness, and it does introduce this idea of the world being so terrible and so jaded and so far away from humanity that when people see someone being executed, they don't just think of how a human life is taken away, but they laugh at its erection. But again, even if you look at it in that way, it's not relevant to the story, and I couldn't understand why introducing this grotesque combination between sexuality and execution. Now, look, I don't have a problem with it in itself. There are some stories that are disgusting. There are some stories that get this visceral reaction from you, and I accept it, but when it's done with a clear purpose. In this case, there's no clear purpose. It's just shock value, and I hated it. I left the best for last. I don't think I can make a review of this film without talking about the casting choices. When it comes to Heathcliff and Edgar, you get very clear descriptions of what they look like in the book. This is Heathcliff, this is how he is described, and this is how Edgar is described in the book. That is very intentional. As you can see in Edgar's description, this is something Heathcliff says about him, and he says, "I wish I were fair-skinned like him." Given Hindley's treatment, he realizes that he's one of the reasons Catherine marrying him would degrade him. It is because the color of his skin. So that's important to Heathcliff and to the story. Now, what dark skin or darker skin looks like, that's of course debatable, open to interpretation. There's a lot of variety of dark skin, but it's definitely not this. Edgar doesn't look like that, and I do understand commercially and all that, but I didn't like that choice because again, it adds a lot to the story to have Heathcliff being dark-skinned and Edgar being his opposite and being fair-skinned. So yeah, that definitely left something to be desired. I feel like it wasn't the best decision to change this about Heathcliff, because again, it's very relevant to his character, and you feel that in the story ultimately, because Heathcliff doesn't have a lot of people to get revenge on. The father dies, and after that he just gets to leave his affair with Kathy. He kind of gets revenge on Linton by marrying Isabella. There isn't that deep motivation behind his vengeful nature like you have in the book. So in conclusion, to wrap it up, as a film I wouldn't say it's that bad, but as an adaptation I think it changes very essential things to the story to the point where it just becomes unrecognizable. It's a completely different story. Going back to what I said in the beginning, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I'll reiterate, adaptations are the interpretation of the director, and if she chose to interpret Wuthering Heights through the eyes of her as a teenager, who am I to say that's wrong? But I think it's fair to criticize it through the lens of it not being faithful to the novel. And again, this faithfulness comes to the very essence of the novel, which is this contrast between civilization and nature, and this process of nature being civilized, whereas the film is just a doomed love story between two misunderstood protagonists that are trauma bonded. So that was my opinion. If you care to, I'd love to read your opinions in the comments. That being said, I promise that this is my last video on Wuthering Heights. I don't know exactly what my next video is going to be. I have nothing planned, so I cannot make any promises. So if you care to stick around, I'd love to see you in my next one, whatever it's going to be. That is all from me. Thank you for watching and listening to my rant, and hopefully I'll see you in my next video. Bye!